Wasatch Report, shooting straight on everything from prepping to politics.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Wasatch Report. My name is Suzanne Sherman. I will be your host for the next hour here on the Cerberus Radio Network, where we defend liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny. Today is Wednesday, June 20th, year of our Lord 2018. We do have a phone number, 717-467-1736. That's 717-467-1736. You're welcome to participate. You can also reach us at facebook.com. You can message me directly at Suzanne Sherman's The Wasatch Report or on my page, Suzanne Sherman. We have a Cerberus Radio Network page also on Facebook, as well as a fan page, CRN. We also have a YouTube channel, and that is Cerberus Radio Network. We invite you to subscribe for that. We are not your typical morning or radio talk show. We like to do more than just read the headlines. You can get that. You can get that anywhere. You can listen to that, watch it all day long, and hear the same topics on any mainstream media network. We're trying to come at modern day solutions here with historical perspectives. We still hold true to our former motto, 18th century ideas for 21st century thinkers. And that is really relevant today with regards to our immigration issues, with regards to so many of the things that we're hearing right now. And what I really do not hear, even with a gun control education, we are not hearing what did our founders say about these issues? What was the government we agreed to? Is adhering to or honoring the Constitution the solution? Was the Constitution a document that would guarantee our liberty, preserve our liberties in the future? Or do we need to look for other sources? Last Monday on our last show, we ran out of time because Jeff and I hadn't had to do a show in a week, and we had a lot to catch up on. So kind of got away from us, and I spent about 15 minutes on a topic that I wanted to spend an hour on. I'm going to be revisiting the Mises article, and it was called Liberty versus the Constitution, and it's actually an excerpt from a book by Knox on Jefferson. So we will be discussing that. I have that printed out. A couple of quick announcements. I want you to also consider downloading our app. It is for the Android platform. And if you do that, we have a Radio Co feed, and you can hear our shows on a 24/7 loop. If you get tired of listening to the same thing over and over again, even though some of our programming is recorded, some of it is not original, but we have permission from our good friends. For instance, Mike Meharry at the 10th Amendment Center has his podcast. That is available. Sean Hoffine out of Tucson, Arizona has his show. Mike and Peter Schiff also have podcasts called Schiff Gold. So if you're interested in learning about investing in precious metals, that is a great resource for you as well. The Other Side with our hosts, Justin and Mike, also will be coming on. We'll be doing a little bit more live programming with them, hopefully starting next week. We are trying to bring you consistent live programming in the mornings, so you can tune in on your morning drive. Jeff Johnson was before me with his show, The Paradigm Shift. He and Daniel Bailey also have their show they do together called The Renegade and The Rambler. Jeff, have I left anything or anybody out? I don't want to omit any of our talent here.
I don't believe so. I think that is everybody. I mean, and honestly, I'm going to say something. We never discussed this before the show. I'm going to say this. If there's anyone out there that's even remotely interested in, seeing if you're interested in doing radio, we're always looking to add new live talent. There is a bit of commitment to this, though. I mean, it's amazing the amount of time I spend on this, and none of us are getting paid. We do this out of love for the subject matter of liberty. And if there's someone out there that's interested in doing it, a year and a half ago, I knew nothing about radio. And now, well, we semi-do it pro. I'm not going to say we do it professionally, but we're semi-pros at this point.
You know, boy, have we come a long way, haven't we, Jeff? I go back to our first shows, and when I made a first telephone call, I think I got into this when I did 2015. excuse me, and I took my boys on that RV trip. And when I started realizing the false narrative and the propaganda and revisionist history being taught going back, I noticed it on Interstate 70 approaching Lecompton, what was it, in Kansas. And the billboard said, it was the birthplace of the end of slavery and had a picture of Abraham Lincoln there. Well, he had nothing to do with the actions in Kansas at the time and the violence that went on there. So, you know, we really need to, and then this just got worse, by the way, when I went to Harper's Ferry, Monticello, Montpelier, and this is all detailed and described at great length in an article called Will the Founders Be Remembered as Slaveholders? That was the first article I had published in the American Conservative. And, you know, this is what we see constantly in the mainstream media programs, this false narrative with regards to history and some of these great conservatives and their praises of Lincoln, the great emancipator, or Mark Levin. He was the greatest emancipator of all times. And he compares him to the rhetoric hearkening the Declaration of Independence. Mark Cressens and I are going to do a show on the Declaration of Independence very soon. But what I want to do is lay the groundwork for that show by examining the Constitution. Was this actually a document that granted us our liberty? And before I jump into that, I want to give a quick reminder. Today is finally the day, Wednesday, June 20th, Yellowstone, the show that was filmed partially at my house. And no, the big, huge, monstrous mansion log cabin that you see in the trailers is not my home. That is the home of Kevin Costner's character, John Dutton. He is the owner of the largest contiguous cattle ranch in this continental landmass. My character that lives in my home is a guy named Thomas Rainwater, played by Gil Birmingham, who was in Hell or High Water with Jeff Bridges. He's done a multitude of other movies as well. Brilliant actor. He was in Wind River, also released, I think, 2 years ago. So that is my place. I don't know how much of it you will see. I know my street I saw on the commercial, but they did some rewriting. But I understand, hopefully, we will see more of him in season 2. But I am looking very much forward to the debut of that program tonight. So that will be on the Paramount Channel. Jeff, I don't plug a lot of TV shows, but this one looks good. And I have a vested interest in the success of the show. I really enjoy having them here. So that being said, I also want to refer you. It seems like, again, in the news, so many of the articles I've written, because I do try to find topics that make past rhetoric, past logic relevant with today. So I want to remind you, look up on the 10th Amendment Center my article, The Constitutional Solution for Immigration. We have a lot of upset people about this phenomenon of children being separated from their families. Again, if we adhered to our foundational principles, this would not be the issue it has become today. And also, national reciprocity is a Trojan horse. Church of the national government, muskets to AR-15. Are they actually weapons against tyranny? And that, you know, I really encourage people to look up these articles. We have a lot of solid history that backs up our proposition. And if we can look at today's current events with that perspective, I think we could find a lot of the answers. Jeff, my take right now is, once again, we have the progressive left using children as a weapon. Somebody the other day said, you know, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, all the terrorists like to hide behind their children. I think our progressives are actually weaponizing children and the plight of children to advance their agenda. Does that sound like a fair assessment to you?
Yes, it does. And you know what's really interesting? If you look back to the pictures of another bygone government, you'll see that one dictator did the very same thing. He would surround himself with children. It's all about children. And we're seeing that today. They're using these children are merely props. Let's just be honest. That's what they are.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You know, in Salt Lake City a couple months ago, I was walking down there by the Temple Square, and a young lady approached me and said, "Would you like to sign this petition?" I asked her, "Well, what is it for?" "Well, we're trying to expand health care for children in Utah." Well, of course I want to expand health care for children. Guess what? Children in Utah already have health care. What they're trying to do is redistribute wealth and expand the expense of health insurance, mandating coverage, making more children eligible, because it really is all about the children. Do you remember when the debate for the Affordable Care Act was going? There was a representative at the time, he's retired now, John Dingell. He was a member of the House of Representatives, the state of Michigan. The guy was like 90 years old. And they actually got him in an interview to say, well, this health care, Affordable Care Act and healthcare reform is the means by which we need to control the people. He actually said that. What happened was immediately his wranglers and his staff said, well, he misspoke. Well, anytime a politician, and I'm not going to single out Democrats, swerve into the truth, they say they misspoke, because the truth is oftentimes ugly. If you want to, by the way, get back to a basic understanding of what our founding principles are, don't go to the public school system. Don't go to the hacks like David Barton. Go to Liberty Classroom. Go to Tom Wood's Liberty Classroom. If you go in there, you can get a basic membership discounted $40 from $89 to $49. And that is by Tom Woods. You can go there and in the checkout, enter the code CRN for Cerberus Radio Network. There's a relatively new series of lectures by Brian McClanahan on Alexander Hamilton. It's premised on his book, How Alexander Hamilton Screwed Up America. Some of those principles I'm going to be touching on this article today. Also, there's an upcoming new series by Kevin Gutzman, and that is going to be about Thomas Jefferson. So right there, if you listen to those two lectures, you can hear the heart and soul of the earliest conflicts of our foundational principles. Were we going to have a strong central government with an elected monarchy who could rule in perpetuity? That really is what our general government has become, by the way. Or are we going to be decentralized and have the remaining power, that which was not delegated to the general government, remaining to the states and to the people? That is what we had consented to. Sadly, we have inverted, and the former has taken over. And that is why we have so many of the issues and the problems that we're dealing with today. Nationalization of a decentralized federalist society is why we have the debt, the wars, the immigration issues, the standing for the national anthem, all these other problems that we're seeing, everything that is plaguing us today, all the gun control issues, the gay marriage, the gays being forced to, or forcing Christians to bake cakes for them. This is all because of a national agenda and a push to take away from the people their choice, their freedom of association, all to push a progressive agenda. Jeff, this kind of harkens to me also Agenda 21. We've talked about that. If we want to have this global society, we need to disavow our traditions, eschew our family values, and embrace globalism by substituting the collective for the individual. And we are seeing that even at the local levels. And in this continental landmass, but for the Constitution, this wouldn't be happening. Jeff, you talk a lot about Patrick Henry. I'm going to ask you to interject a little bit when I get into this topic. Did you have a chance to read that article? I think it was really fascinating. And again, it was an excerpt from Albert J. Nock's book on Thomas Jefferson. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have the article right here in front of me. I printed it out, and yes, I did read it.
I kind of feel like I was asking you if you did your homework assignment. I'm really sorry for
yes, Mom, I did my homework.
Did you make your bed before the show as well? Oh my goodness.
I did.
Well, as I touched on last week, or Monday, I should say, the Constitution looked good on paper, and that's how this chapter in the article starts out. But it was not a popular document at the time, and people were suspicious of it. You mentioned that all the time, Patrick Henry. The suspicious nature of this legislation was going to be forced upon these people, if they agreed to it, had been laid down. This Constitution had been laid down under some very strange auspices, and its history has been that of, really, it was a bloodless coup, as he alludes to in this article. It had been drafted, Knox says, by men representing special economic interests. 4/5 of them were public creditors. 1/3 were land speculators. A fifth represented interests in shipping, manufacturing, and merchandising. Most of them were lawyers. Well, there you go. Not one of them represented the interest of production. You really didn't see these agrarian farmers being represented here. And this is what I talked to about, and Brian McClanahan, I'm trying to get him on the show, explains this and how Alexander Hamilton screwed up America. We had this early on conflict between the mercantilists, the industrialists, and that was the Hamiltonians. And then we had the Jeffersonians that were the agrarians. They were the means of production who believed in the decentralized government. And interestingly enough, when we look at who the former group was, really John Taylor of Caroline, he was absolutely prophetic. I think one of the smartest members of that generation. He said to beware of the unholy alliance between government and finance. And boy, isn't that exactly what we're seeing today? It is an unholy alliance between government and finance, really, with that taking place, taking absolute precedence over the agrarian group. So what I want to get into today is this article, which explains how this came about and how those who are responsible for the means of production are really suffering under this. We have really lost our agrarian heritage, I think. You know, I talked on Monday about my trip to Gillette, Wyoming. And one thing I forgot to mention when I was describing these kids, these teenagers that came out to work on this farm, they gave up a Saturday. They weren't getting paid, but they were helping a member of their community. And my friend Tex Adams, the owner of this ranch, said to me, 5 years ago, the federal government proposed a law that would have prohibited anybody under 18 from working on these ranches at all. Well, isn't that a direct slap in the face to the farmers who want to get their kids working on these farms, passing these farms down to their families and keeping these farms in the families? Unfortunately, the inheritance taxes really ruin a lot of those plans. But, these were the people that were really suffering, and had this law passed, these children would not have been allowed to work on these farms. They were 16, 17 years old. They worked really hard. I find that is one of the Agenda 21 means also of disrupting our traditions. But anyway, I digress a little bit, and I do that, which is why I needed to set an entire hour aside for this topic. The Articles of Confederation, to which the states had subscribed in good faith as a working agreement, I'm going back to the article now, made provisions for their own amendment. And now the men had ignored these provisions and simply putting the Articles of Confederation in the wastebasket and bringing forth an entirely new document of their own devising. Now, remember,
Suzanne,
yeah.
Can I just jump in here? I'm going to give you some Patrick Henry on the Articles.
Let me some Patrick Henry, go.
All right. The Confederation, this same despised government, merits, in my opinion, the highest encomium. It carried us through a long and dangerous war. It rendered us victorious in that bloody conflict with a powerful nation. It has secured us a territory greater than any European monarch possesses. And shall a government which has been thus strong and vigorous be accused of imbecility and abandoned for want of energy? Consider what you're about to do before you part with this government. Patrick Henry, June 5th, 1788.
That still gives me goosebumps. Yeah, I'm kind of a Patrick Henry freak. Look, we are taught in school. I remember these lessons when we were taught about our government, that the Articles of Confederation were an abject failure. What did we accomplish under the Articles of Confederation? Gee, I don't know. We defeated the most powerful military might in the world. They set up their own, these colonies, which in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson indicated, are and ought to be free and independent states, states being on the par of England, France, Spain, etc. We are taught that the Articles were a failure. Nothing could get done. Jeff, if you look at what we have today, I fantasize about a government that can get nothing done. Please get nothing done. Please have another shutdown. But as we know, government shutdown does not really mean a government shutdown. And we are taught in school that the Articles were a failure, and this stronger centralized government was absolutely necessary to the survival of this new nation. No, it wasn't a nation. This is what I'm talking about, the trifecta of evil. Government, the school system, and the media, with the former regulating, the latter two with regards to their licensings, their accreditations, grants, you name it, they control the narrative. So it is no mystery why the mistakes, the errors are always made in the favor of a strong central government. Lincoln is absolutely glorified, while men like Robert E. Lee are excoriated, and they use the classic Saul Alinsky tactics. They make them into a bunch of racists. When you lose on the merit, play the race card. And this is what we're seeing. So yes, Jeff, that was fantastic commentary on the Articles of Confederation and proof that at the time it was not a consensus that the Articles were a failure. Why, by the way, did a few of them, Madison, I think it was Edmund Randolph, get there early? And you can read about this in Original Intent by M.E. Bradford. By the way, Original Intentions it is. Original Intent is by David Barton. That's the one you want to get away from. Interestingly enough, if you do a search, he was very clever. His book comes up first because you get to Original Intent. Anyway, so we have this false narrative. These people got there early, and it made those that were presenting, that were intent on creating a more perfect union and not a strong government, it put them on the defense. He got there early. They proposed this new plan. It put those wanting to maintain, a decentralized government on the defensive. And why were they sworn to secrecy during this project? Why were those at the Philadelphia Convention sworn to secrecy? Why did they want to keep that quiet? Because it was a coup. To me, character is what you are doing when nobody is looking. Well, they kept people from looking, and they subverted the intention of the original Philadelphia Convention. Let me return back to the article. Man, I'm only a third of the way to the first page, and I've got, I think, 5 pages to go through. The Constitution was promulgated with similar economic interests in the several states, had laid hold of it and pushed it through the ratification in the state conventions as a minority measure by methods that had an obvious intent to defeat the popular will. The most disturbing fact of all, according to this article, the administration of government under the Constitution remained wholly in the hands of the men who had devised the document or who had been leaders for ratification in the several states. The new president, Washington, had presided over the Constitutional Convention. The members had become Supreme Court judges, judges on federal district courts, members of the cabinet who had been there and became members of the Senate. So these people that were there now became members of this general government, and all 3 branches apparently were going to check their own power. And we've seen how that worked. Now, as we know, Thomas Jefferson was not present during the Philadelphia Convention. And this chapter discusses Jefferson's response and his reaction to the Constitution. They say here that Mr. Jefferson was slow to apprehend what I just described. He had regarded the Constitution as a purely political document, and having that view, had spoken both for and against it. His criticism really was that it had no Bill of Rights and did not provide against the indefinite tenure in office. He went to New York in March of 1790, and that was a temporary capital. And it says here he found himself a cat in a strange garret. Washington and his entourage greeted him, and the circle of principal citizens welcomed him as a distinguished and agreeable man. The people of New York could have quite taken him to their hearts if they had not felt, as everyone felt his presence, that he was always graciously but firmly holding them off. He starts to the article moves on to discuss what was really the concern of the day. Now, this is coming on the heels of the French Revolution. And nobody in this article is saying here, no one in New York was even talking about natural rights at this point. The principal citizens were really talking about the need for a strong government. Again, the Constitution now had been ratified, and what was consented to was a decentralized government, certain powers being enumerated to Congress, to the general government, the rest remaining with the states. Paraphrasing James Madison, that the power of the general government was few and defined, and those remaining with the states were numerous and indefinite. That's the heart and soul of the 10th Amendment. That's the heart and soul of federalism. But what happened here? Jefferson's ideas now were being viewed as outmoded, and others were coming to the forefront. And then Washington's cabinet comes together. Enter Alexander Hamilton. He saw this, what was going on in the United States, these United States, this America at the time, as an opportunity for him to have great power, to accumulate great power. He saw that Washington was going to be somebody that would be worthy for him to get close to, and that's exactly what he did, becoming his aide-de-camp, his right-hand man during the Revolutionary War. So what we see here, there's a really interesting comment in this article that Hamilton's sense of public duty was as keen as his personal ambition. He was a foreigner, underprivileged, of obscure origin and illegitimate birth. John Adams actually called him the bastard son of a Scots peddler. Yet he climbed to the top by tenacity and sheer will. Now, it strikes me that these were this ability to succeed, notwithstanding a difficult beginning, was really what made America a wonderful place, why people came here. But what we're going to see is that he actually eschewed these values in centralizing this government, made it even more difficult. What we also see is we now have these battles for equality under a system that makes it next to impossible. Did you want to chime in on that a little bit, Jeff? I've been kind of going on a...
No, keep going.
Okay. So in the rise that he had taken on the self-made man's disregard of highly favorable circumstances, the people he saw were a great beast, irrational, passionate, violent, dangerous, needing a strong hand to keep them in order. Remember what I said earlier about John Dingell's comment? We need to regulate healthcare to keep the people controlled. This is the mean by which we control the people. This goes back to that early conflict. We need to control the people. Well, how are we going to do that? By interfering in all aspects of their life vis-a-vis the strength and might of the federal, national government. What we see here, again, he eschewed the very system, culture, political climate that made his success possible. He had no faith, going back to the article, in Republican government. As Governor Morris acutely said, he confounded Republican government with a democratical government, and he detested the latter because he believed it must end in despotism and, in the meantime, destructive to public morality. How much of that is true right now? And again, we hear time and time again about threats to our democracy, and I hear that both on the left and the right. It strikes me as completely the antithesis to what came about here. We did not form a democracy. We had a representative constitutional republic. This is what Hillary Clinton was referring to when she was complaining that she won the popular vote. Well, had she been victorious, we would have had a democracy. I think we're inching closer and closer to it, particularly since the Senate lost their ability to be, or the states lost their ability to choose their senators, and now that also comes under popular election as well. So the Republican government was here, and Hamilton could not change it. Again, going back to the article, of all among the rich and well-born who talked more or less seriously of setting up a monarchy, there was none doubtless unaware that the Republican system could hardly be displaced unless by another coup d'etat made possible by some profound disturbance like a war. This is, and I mentioned this before, James Madison had said, of all the threats to liberty, a standing army was the greatest, because when you have a standing army, you have war, you have debt, you have taxes, and you have control over the many by the few. And we're seeing that that was recognized very early on. In fact, I'm going to bring up my article about the AR-15 muskets. To AR-15, are they weapons of war or enemies of tyranny? I would invite you to read that article for more on that historic bit of information that we have there. So Hamilton had a general plan of safeguarding the republic in the form of imprudence of democracy, and its root was that of consolidating the interests of certain broad classes of the rich and well-born with the interests of the government. Remember, John Taylor of Caroline, beware of the unholy alliance of government and finance. We are seeing the genesis of that with the Hamiltonian goals here. He began with the government's creditors. Many of these, probably a majority, were speculators who had bought the government's war bond at a low price from investors who were too poor to keep their holdings. Remember now, this resulted in Shays' Rebellion. I touched on that on Monday. And after these people lost their shirts because of the bondholders, the security holders, Hamilton really set that as a message that he declared that those original holders should have had more confidence in their government than to sell out their holdings, and that subsidizing speculators would broadcast this lesson. In my article about the AR-15, there was fear that he was going to use the standing army to intimidate those that might be against the general government. This is why we had the militias. They didn't, at the founding generation, they did not want to have a standing army, because in England, the king could use his army to suppress oppression, to attack those that might have a dissenting view towards their policies. That sentiment carried over here as well. So again, we're seeing the Hamiltonian perspective and the like of war, using a war to expand the government. And we're seeing this throughout history. So his first move was for the funding of obligations of the government at face value, thereby putting the interests of the speculator on a par with those of the original holder. He fused both classes into a bulwark of support for the government. Unholy alliance, government, and finance. This was inflation on a large scale, for the values presented by the government security were in part probably 60% notoriously fictitious, and were so regarded even by the holders. A feeble minority in Congress, led by Madison, tried to amend Hamilton's measure in a small way by proposing a fair discrimination against the speculator, but without success. And I talked before that one of the ways by which we started to dismantle the state's powers was with the assumption of the debts. Some of the states had already covered their war debts, but when this national government decided to in a compromise in exchange for having the capital now located in a southern state was going to be an assumption of the debt. The federal government would take it over, and that was obviously going to be unfair to those who had already paid their war debts off. So his first move, like I said, was for the funding of the obligations for the government at face value. He put the interests of the speculator on a par with those of the original holder. Before any effective popular opposition could be organized, and this is really important, Hamilton's bill was driven through a Congress which reckoned nearly half its membership among the security holders. Now, that is a conflict of interest. Jeff, I don't know if you remember, a while back, there was a scandal where it became very apparent. I think Nancy Pelosi in particular would take information that these representatives would glean during congressional hearings and then trade on the stock market and profit. If you or I did that, or Martha Stewart, we would call that insider trading and go to prison. Well, they finally had a statute. Congress passed a law saying that they could no longer do that. What did they do shortly thereafter? They repealed that very law. We are seeing right now also that there's a set of laws with this big scandal with the FBI going on. There's a set of laws for those of us, and there's a set of laws for our oligarchs. Do you think that's a fair assessment, Jeff?
Yes, I remember that that whole incident where they passed the law and where they repealed it. And, you know, that is how, quite honestly, you think about it. You have these people going to Washington, D.C., you know, of modest middle class. And what do they leave there? They leave there multimillionaires. You have Pelosi or Feinstein, one of those two. Their husband is a defense contractor, lobbyist, or along that line, and they're making hundreds of millions of dollars. It's obscene. This whole marriage of finance and government is what this article talks about, and that we're living it today. Yeah,
absolutely. Let me find actually a case here. I want to find it. Fletcher v. Peck is another case in which Justice John Marshall, who was present, and I had it already highlighted in my book, but of course I can't find it now. He actually ruled in a manner that would benefit him and other holders in Florida. It goes back to the contracts case, contracts clause. Let me find it here. I think it's page 80. Fletcher versus Peck. So let's go back. Again, we had decisions made early on that show we had conflicts of interest. Chief Justice Marshall had decided, okay, well, I'm going to back up a little bit because I do have time. I saved myself extra time for this. The Supreme Court considered a case under the Contracts Clause. It was called Fletcher's v. Peck in 1810. I am getting this out of the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution by Kevin Gutzman. And I learned more in this book than I did in my entire law school career, history, whatever you want to call it. But this case arose out of the Yazoo scandal. It was one of the great public swindles in the history of the world, he says. A group of land investors had bribed all but one of the Georgia legislature to sell them an enormous area of public land, most of what is now Alabama and Mississippi, I beg your pardon, virtually for nothing. The sale was completed in 1795 as a grant of land to a private company, but then repealed, and the bribed legislators were cast out in 1796. John Peck bought this title to some of the land in 1800 and sold it to Robert Fletcher. Fletcher next sued Peck for the purchase price, saying that his supposed title had been negated by the legislative repeal of the original sale and was thus worthless. So now this brings us, we have the Contracts Clause. Chief Justice Marshall for the court had decided that the nub of the issue was whether a legislature's grant of public land qualified as a contract under the Contracts Clause. He and his fellow justices decided that it did. So the Supreme Court ruled the state law, Georgia's repeal of the 1795 land grant, unconstitutional and void, which in practical terms meant that according to the Supreme Court, people had no democratic remedy to correct the bribed action of a corrupt legislator. Not only was Marshall's equivalence of grants and contracts dubious, but he also skipped over a crucial point, which was whether Georgia ever had a contractual obligation, given that the land grant was a result of bribery in the first place. In the Northwest Ordinance's contract clause illustrates, or as the Northwest Ordinance's contracts clause illustrates, the obligation of contracts was understood to be dependent on the absence of fraud and coercion. This legal understanding was universal, but Justice Marshall ignored it, and with dire results. We are taught this on the first day of contracts in law school. Contracts must be entered into freely, voluntarily, without fraud. You have to have particular circumstances, time of performance, etc. So what they're saying here was there is absolutely no democratic means by which you could remedy fraud. So this interestingly enough, Marshall had two incentives to rule as he did in the Fletcher case. One was personal and one was institutional. From a personal point, he himself had been a substantial investor in these unsettled lands, so he might be expected to favor people who claim to have received state grants. Institutionally, Marshall saw in the Georgia land case an opportunity to buttress the position of the judicial branch in the federal system and to help make national what had been intended as a federal constitution. This is crucial because these were the people that were entrusted. Justice John Marshall was present at the Virginia Ratification Convention. He knew what the states had consented to. He understood that what he ruled here, first of all, he had a personal conflict of interest. We are taught in law school that we as minion lawyers, not justices, not members of Congress, but we as minion rank and file have an obligation to avoid not only conflicts of interest, but even the appearance of impropriety. Speaking of which, look at the behavior of our government these days. I don't think they do anything that doesn't appear to be improper. Jeff, can you give me some examples of how wonderful our government is and how honest and the integrity under which they are operating? Because I'm not seeing much of that these days.
Oh, please don't put me on the spot like that, because it'll take me a couple of days to find something.
We'll have dead air for
yeah. 20 minutes of dead air. People, I think the listeners will go away real fast if they wait for us to come up with an answer to that one.
Seeking. Yes. So I mean, even
Bueller.
Yeah. These members were security holders, going back to what Hamilton was doing back here. And we have this is the thing. When I talked about if the means of communication were then what they are now, almost immediately, I think the agrarian-based states who premised their participation in this being a voluntary union. In fact, several northern states threatened to secede. Secession wasn't considered illegal until 1861. So we see, we had McCulloch versus Maryland. We had this Fletcher v. Peck. We had these early instances where it became apparent that this new government was not going to adhere to, honor, respect their constraints. Why was there not this mass exodus on the part of the states? It was communication. And this is also allured to in the article here too, because these people did not have the ability I think, to mobilize and fight what was going on here. Let me get to that point here. So we had capitalists involved now in the system of government, looking out for their own interests, as we're also seeing with the case of Marshall here. And we're looking at how they were going to rule trade and commerce. Want to get on to the part of the article that talks about finishing up with assumption. Two groups of capitalists' interests remained awaiting Hamilton's attention here. And they say that one of them was actual, one other was inchoate, developing. And these were the interests in trade and commerce. Again, when you hear the word commerce, this is another means by which this government has nationalized and thrown off its restraints and controlling every aspect of our lives. We have the interest of unattached capital looking for safe investment. And there was no breathless hurry about these, as there had been about digging into impregnable entrenchments of funding and assumption. Remember, we had the compromise of the assumption of the state debts in exchange for putting the capital in what was formerly part of Virginia. We had a tariff. Again, that's something that will rear its ugly head again many times for revenue. And though it explicitly recognized the principle of protection, we're talking about tariffs today with Donald Trump and steel tariffs, it was enough to keep them cheerful until more could be done for them. Considering the second group, Hamilton devised a plan to go for a federal bank with a capital of $10 million, 1/5 of which would be subscribed by the government and the remainder distributed to the investing public in shares. So now what we have, and again, I encourage you to read this article. You can it takes some time to go through. This tied up the fortunes of individual investors with the fortunes of the government and gave them a proprietary interest in maintaining the government's stability. Beware of the unholy alliance between government and finance. One of the reasons he was able to do these banking activities as well was under the doctrine of implied powers. And what he said, Hamilton's argument was, it is implied that if you have the power to coin money, you have the power to have a national bank. Well, parliamentary sovereignty is really why we went to war. Great Britain had no written constitution, and the other founders said, look, if we don't have a written constitution, it's akin to having no constitution at all. Well, when you have this doctrine of implied powers, when they say it is implied that if you can do A, you absolutely must do B, then we have reverted back to parliamentary sovereignty, where we really don't have a written constitution, and anything that the general government does is per se valid. So that was an issue here. So the article sums up that the primary development of republicanism in America, for the most part, under the direction of Alexander Hamilton, effectively safeguarded the monopolist, the capitalist, and the speculator. Its institutions embraced the interests of these three groups and opened the way for their harmonious progress and association. The only interest which it left open to free exploitation was that of the producer, except insofar as the producer might incidentally and partially bear the character of the monopolist, capitalist, and speculator. His interest was unconsidered. I think, Jeff, the article wraps up with that paragraph, and I really think that explains so much, because if you look at how we have progressed or devolved over the years, we really don't see much concern for the producers in our society. In fact, I think we're seeing a disdain for them. We are seeing that the traditional family farmers are being regulated into having to go out of business. We are seeing that the corporate farmers are taking the place of the traditional family cattle ranchers, trying to grow your own vegetables or have your own dairy farms. Watch a movie it's a documentary called Food Inc. And it shows the government regulation of factory farming and why it is so difficult to have farmers grow food in healthy manners. It's just absolutely astounding to me. By the way, none of this power was ever delegated to the general government in Article 1, Section 8. Jeff, can you find ranching in Article 1, Section 8 anywhere? I'm looking. I'm not seeing it anywhere.
No, it's not there.
No, it's not there. But yet we have this, we just always look to the general government, the federal government, to regulate these products, these services. I had a very liberal financial advisor whom I fired when I was in California, and she was talking about, she was talking about America no longer being a nation of producers. We are not a nation of producers anymore. We provide services. And I just found that to be such a profoundly arrogant statement. Good for her and her financial degree, her pedigree from one of the trifectas, one of the members of the trifecta of evil from one of the universities, to eschew the value of those who manufacture, who actually produce goods instead of numbers, which are really no more than vapors. To say that we no longer produce, what about the people in this continental landmass that do produce? Do they have no value? What about the steel workers? What about the coal miners? What about the people that are out there working in the oil fields, on the oil rigs? Do they not count? This is the disdain these people, as part of the unholy alliance of finance and government, have for the salt of the earth Americans. Look at the areas in which the financiers and mercantilists are located. On the coasts, we see them primarily on the coasts. We see the farmers, the ranchers, the producers in the other parts of the country that they refer to as the flyover states. The people, the means of production, are so unworthy of visiting, we're just going to fly over them. I'm telling you, this is why I love my motorhome. I get in there and I travel these roads and I meet these people that are the salt of the earth people. They represent the values upon which we were founded. These people need a voice. These people are being regulated to death. Their interests are being sold out. Their hard-earned income is being exploited. When we are sending money overseas to ensure women can be police officers in Afghanistan, when we are sending money to United Nations, by the way, we just pulled out of we're going to be leaving the Human Rights Commission, I believe, on the United Nations. Did you hear about that, Jeff?
Yes, and my comment to that was that we just need to leave the UN completely.
Yes, exactly. I wonder if we're still funding it in its entirety as well. Why don't we get out of the United Nations? Why don't we get out of NATO while we are at it? Again, all of these costs, all of these involvements, I just don't understand why we are doing this. But let's go back to the Constitution and ask yourself, is this Constitution that some people say is divinely inspired? Do you remember when Mark Kreslins was on this show and he just went on a tear? Because of the Constitution, we have had a committee, a panel of 9 unelected federal judges and justices, politically connected, politically appointed lawyers in their black costumes, decree that a woman's right to murder her baby is the law of the land. 60 million and counting. Please tell me how this document promotes liberty. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and the laws and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. That is the document we should be looking towards for inspiration to promote liberty, not the Constitution. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. All men are created equal. This is the battle call of the progressive movement. This is a Straussian interpretation that equality is really what we are going for. Tom Woods, I believe, calls equality the bloodiest idea ever created. So Title 18, United States Code 2385. When this document was signed and delivered to the King of England, the signers were subject to treason. They knew that they were going to be penalized severely if they were caught. They understood that they had a right to consent to their system of government. They also knew that they weren't going to go on their merry way without a fight. Again, Title 18, United States Code 2385 makes it a federal offense to teach even. It's not even just advocate, but it says to teach the necessity of the violent overthrow of the United States government. Arguably, teaching the Declaration of Independence violates a federal statute. According to the Constitution as ratified, the general government has the authority to punish 3 crimes: piracy on the high seas, counterfeiting, and treason. So unless you are saying that teaching about the consent of the governed, the principles set forth in the Declaration of Independence is treason, we are ostensibly violating a federal statute. Tell me how this conforms with the principle that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Please tell me how, when we have elected representatives who will not ever even read, let alone see our correspondence, our pleas for them to hear our wishes, to assent to what we want them to do. We don't have that anymore. Please tell me which document represents freedom, guarantees liberty. It is not the Constitution. We need a reset. We need to go back and embrace the principles set forth in the Declaration of Independence. I want to thank you for letting me just dig deep into this topic today. I think it's a really important subject, and I'm going to be spending more time on the Declaration of Independence as July 4th, Independence Day, approaches. We need to get back to our founding principles, and I mean 1776, not 1787. I want to thank you for joining Jeff Johnson and I today on the Wasatch Report. here at the Cerberus Radio Network, where we defend freedom and liberty from the flames of tyranny. God bless you.